So my name is Ethan Marcotte. I'm Beep on Twitter. And I'd like to start today by ending my career. I feel like I trust you guys, because I have a confession to make. I am an impossibly, incredibly lazy person. It's true. But I'll get to that in a minute, because I'd like to start today by telling you a story about a tree. Now, this is a fairly special tree. It's located in the heart of the Pando forest. Now, Pando's located in Utah. It's part of the Fish Lake National Reserve, if you happen to know the area. And Pando's a fairly good-sized forest. It's some 106 acres in size, filled with these beautiful white trunks just shooting up out of the ground, covered with these bright shocks of gold leaves in the cooler months, or maybe something really vibrant and green in the warmer ones. And as you and I are traveling through this forest side by side, there's some time that passes, and eventually I turn to you, and I say that I've misled you, just a little bit. Because the thing about Pando is that it's not a forest. Pando is really just one tree. Pando is actually the Latin term for I spread. And Pando is what's known as a clonal colony. So it's basically one giant quaking aspen tree. So each of the trees that you and I might see with our eyes are actually just stems, all of them shooting up out of this one massive underground root system that they all share. And there's some 80,000 stems in Pando. 40,000, excuse me. And Pando's age is actually a matter of some debate. Most scientists agree that it's roughly 80,000 years old, although some scientists would actually say that it's closer to 1 million years old. But regardless of where you actually happen to fall on either side of that debate, Pando is both the largest and one of the oldest known organisms alive on the planet today. This is a talk about web design. I promise you that, because I love this story, not just because of the details, but because I think in recent years, as we've heard from every speaker here today, we've started to see web design's forest for its trees. More specifically around the matter of responsive design, right? As we've moved further and further beyond the desktop, we've understood that this old idea of a page, this holistic sort of entity, this monolithic thing, is no longer our starting point. We don't begin our process by designing or building an abstract system of grids and rows, but rather we start a level below that with the detail work and move up from there. Local friend of mine, Trent Walton, once wrote beautifully about his transition from kind of a responsive design skeptic into somebody who's doing some of the finest responsive design work out there today, I would argue. Those aren't his words. And he talked about how he traded the control he had in Photoshop for a new kind of control. Not less, but a different kind. One in which he could use flexible grids, flexible images, and media queries to build not a page, but a network of content that could be rearranged at any screen size to best convey a message. And I think there's something really beautiful about that idea, that there's this sort of universe of interface parts and content that we're using to spin around as viewports get wider or smaller to convey a message, to tell a story, to reach more people than ever before. And so we've moved past this idea of building from the canvas in, of sort of creating this like abstract grid and filling it with a bunch of stuff. And instead, now more than ever, as responsive designers and developers, we begin a level below that by designing the individual components and modules that then comprise a larger responsive design system that we stitch together. And each of these individual components or modules and patterns, they often have their own breakpoints. They change and adapt independent of the other small systems around them. But then as we build those small systems, we can then stitch them together up into something whole and present it to our users. I mention this because it's been amazing to sort of see the design community embrace this more pattern-driven approach to designing responsively. And it's been happening at almost every level, from individual designers and developers to small publications, even to major corporations and brands. As they start experimenting more with responsive design, they're really investing themselves in designing these networks of content and information, and using that to experiment with the way that they think about designing information hierarchies and other visual systems. Even something as small as managing and selling advertising gets much more complicated from a pattern-driven approach when you stop thinking about your design as mobile, tablet, and desktop, and really just thinking about this as a network of content presented on the web. Here's the thing, though. As exciting as it is to be designing responsively right now, I think it's safe to say, again, I'm among friends, we kind of have a tough job. This is by no means the hardest industry to work in, but I do think we have our fair share of challenges, right? And you've heard about so many of them today. And in many cases, they tend to be presented in something that looks a little bit more like this. Did anyone else just get that ball of panic right down here? No? Just me? Okay. Because it's not just about individual device classes anymore, right? We're designing for more operating systems than at any other point in the web's very short history. We're designing with more input modes and input mechanisms than ever before. And many devices out there in the marketplace today can't be qualified solely as touch or analog. Some of them actually marry multiple models together really effectively. We're dealing with multiple displays of varying color density and degree. In other words, we are now more than ever at a point now where the words we use to refer to these devices most broadly, desktop, tablet, mobile, are so broad and so inexact as to be completely unhelpful in addressing the scope and complexity of what we're trying to design and build on a daily basis. And I suppose Google Glass is in there somewhere too. Karen and I are big fans of the platform, if you can't tell. But the challenges don't stop there, right? I mean, if anyone else hasn't run for the doors yet, we're dealing with new device classes and browsing contexts than ever before on almost a monthly, if not a weekly basis, things we didn't anticipate. And it doesn't just stop with the form factors. Hardware and software vendors are actively experimenting with new interaction models, like split-screen interfaces that we see in early Windows touch interfaces and that now have hit iOS 9 on iPads. And users of these devices are going to expect that our responsive interfaces are just going to work natively with these new models. And the network that we use on a daily basis to travel the web, to publish our content, to reach our audiences, is far more broadly accessed today than at any other point in its history. But it's also far more volatile and much, much slower than we like to think about when we have discussions about the quality of our work. We are, in 2015, at a point now where the phrase, "don't dig and drive, kids," is something we actually have to think about. There are browsers in cars, literally mounted on dashboards. Does anyone else want to dramatically change the industry that they're working in? Is it just me? I feel like it might just be me. So I'd like to stand in front of you wonderful people today and actually say that, when I'm looking at the challenges in front of us, new device classes, new browsing contexts, the fragility of the network, that I always rise to the occasion, that I always have a perfect solution at hand. But more often than not, when I'm looking at these challenges, my reaction is one of laziness. I get more than a little bit negative. I get incredibly sleepy. It's a defense mechanism. I don't understand it either. And most days, I frankly just want to give up and go back to bed. Always lead with a gift, Mom said. She never said that. The thing about laziness, just as a concept, it's interesting to me because, we use a lot of words in our daily work, right, to talk about the quality of our design, even just to communicate with each other as human beings. And, the thing about those words is that they're so subjective. I could be describing a mutual friend to you who happens to be liberal or conservative. Or maybe I'll describe her as a daydreamer or incredibly logical. And depending on who you are and the values that you hold dear, you could see either one of those words as a compliment or a complaint. Laziness does not have that problem. Everyone just kind of universally agrees this is a terrible thing to be or to aspire to, right? That it's preventing you from being a better version of yourself, from producing a better quality product. But I'm here to suggest today that maybe the picture's a little bit more complicated than that. With all the complexity, with all the challenges that we have, maybe laziness could actually be a little bit of a help rather than a hindrance. There's this quote that I love by Hugh Prather, who once said that my anxiety doesn't come from thinking about the future, but from wanting to control it. And I know, at least for me, as a design professional, that's absolutely true. I look at all these challenges, new device classes, slow, fragile networks, as something that I need to solve, that I need to control. And maybe that's the wrong reaction. Maybe the problem isn't the challenges, but in ourselves and our design practices. So maybe a little bit of laziness, applied intelligently to responsive design and to some of the challenges that we have, can actually be a little bit of a virtue. And maybe it's about having a conversation about how we can intelligently let go of that need to perfectly control the end user experience. So this talk is kind of an open meditation on laziness, as appealing as that might sound. But I've been noticing this idea of doing just a little bit less, manifesting itself in 3 specific areas of my work, and I thought we could maybe step through them in turn. And maybe afterwards, at the party out in the lobby, we could have a discussion about how I'm the laziest person on the planet, or maybe laziness could actually benefit us a little bit more broadly. So with that, let's start right at the top with layout. So when I think about laziness, I've really been seeing it in a lot of my work very recently, but more specifically in two discrete areas: working with videos and embedded media in a responsive design and managing it from a layout perspective, and also with the larger grid systems that I'm designing to build these responsive layouts. So beginning with video and other kinds of embedded objects, there's been a whole bunch of writing done by myself and by other speakers that are on the stage at this event talking about how, if you're working with images in a flexible layout, this rule is the first step in building responsive images. And Jason's going to be talking a lot about the further steps that you have to take in that process, but this is really the first step. And with this max width 100% rule, what that means is that an image that has an intrinsic width and height, when it's in a flexible or fluid layout, basically as the column or container that it sits in changes its shape, that image is never going to expand beyond the width of that container. Its maximum width is 100%. And thanks to all the wonderful, most modern browsers that we have out there today, it's going to resize proportionally within that fluid or responsive grid. So it would be kind of natural to look at that rule and think that if you're working with embedded objects or video, that this would be the first place to start, right? Move to max width 100% for things like objects or video elements. Unfortunately, it's not quite that easy. This is an example from my blog, which is neither responsive nor attractive. But it does have a flexible grid, and you can see that as this embedded YouTube video resizes itself within that flexible container, that max width 100% rule ensures that it never bleeds out of that containing column. And I just realized that video is kind of terrifying without sound. I do apologize about that. But the other worst thing about this is that this is kind of a suboptimal solution, right? Because as the width of the video has changed its width, the height has remained fixed. And this is really a problem of scale. Most embedded objects and other third-party content, like iframes or videos, don't actually have intrinsic dimensions. So we actually have to specify them in the HTML in pixels. Now, the problem with doing so is that we can easily override the width in our CSS, as we just did with that max width 100% rule. But we can't easily do the same thing with height. If we said something like height auto, for example, all of those videos that don't have intrinsic dimensions would essentially be invisible. They'd collapse to being 0 pixels tall. And darn it, the internet needs to see its cat videos. I think we can all agree on that. So this has been an area where a lot of responsive designers and developers have been experimenting over the last few years. This is an early example. This is madebyhand.com. This is a beautiful website, first and foremost. I would recommend checking it out. And it's a wonderful short film series that, because it's in a responsive design, you can see it in pretty much any size screen that you choose. So what they're doing to make their videos resize is that they're using a little bit of JavaScript to measure the dimensions of the video when the page first loads. And then anytime the design resizes itself, or you change the orientation of your device, then it actually resizes the video based off those initial measurements that it made. And this has been a fairly common approach, especially in the early days of responsive design. This is an early version of the Do Lectures website, back when they had their entire video library from their conferences online. And what you'll notice in both this example and This is Made by Hand is that there's a little bit of a visual stutter. It takes a second for the video to catch up with the responsive design as it resizes. Now, this was actually an intentional decision made by the designers of both of these sites, because resizing elements with JavaScript based on changes of the viewport is actually really expensive from a performance standpoint. It can even crash older devices and browsers. So that's why they've throttled it a little bit, and that's what causes that visual stutter. But the technical implementation aside, I think this actually kind of points to an underlying need that maybe JavaScript isn't the best approach for managing the shape of our content. Maybe we can look for a different approach. The nice thing is that this is kind of a solved problem. Back in 2009, Thierry Koblenz wrote this really great but kind of underappreciated article at the time about how we could create intrinsic ratios for video. Now, he was writing at a time when he was talking solely about flexible layouts. This is before the days of responsive design. But his approach is brilliant, and it's a really great way of managing flexible videos in our responsive layouts. And his approach was really great, because if you look at any video on a web page, Terry basically pointed out that obviously they have certain characteristics, like a width and a height, specified in pixels. But if you look past the pixels themselves, those two characteristics actually have a deep and fundamental connection to each other, which is an aspect ratio. And that's measured from one corner of the video down to its diagonal opposite. Now, we can actually measure an aspect ratio of any element, especially videos, by taking its height and dividing it against its width. So if we were to plug our pixels into that formula, we'd be left with an aspect ratio of roughly 56.25%, or 16 by 9 terms if you're a cinemaphile. What we're going to do with that number is we're actually going to put it in our back pocket for just a moment, or fanny pack if that's your conveyance method of preference. But what we're going to then do is go back to our HTML and actually size that video element down so it's small screen friendly by default. And then we're going to surround it with some sort of containing element, like a div with a class of video box. With those two components in place, what I can then do is apply some CSS to them. And I can basically, on that container, I can apply a padding top equal to the aspect ratio I just calculated of 56.25%. And then I can also apply a position relative to it, but we'll get back to that point in a second. Once I apply that padding top, I've created a kind of ghost box at the top of the container. That padding top, because of how the CSS specification works, says that that padding will always be 56.25% as tall as the box is wide. This made no sense to me the first time I tried this, but basically, here's a quick example. I went back to the Do Lectures site back in the day, and I kind of rooted around on my inspector, and I deleted the video entirely. And I spent hours laboring over this beautiful pink background I applied to it. I hope you guys enjoy it. And actually, the text that you see is generated with CSS. So for all intents and purposes, this is a completely empty block of HTML that just has that padding applied to it in the CSS. But because of that proportional padding, it now has an intrinsic aspect ratio, even though it's completely empty. That one empty div now has its own shape and form independent of the width of the entire design. I think this is cool, but this is why I don't really have many friends. Now, this is just the foundation, right? This is obviously not going to do us any good from a media standpoint. But because we've created this ghost box at the top of the container and we've set that position relative to it, we now have a little positioning context inside that container. So we can use absolute positioning on the video itself and anchor it top left inside its container. And then we're going to set its width and height to be 100% of the width and height of its flexible, aspect ratio aware containing element. So this is what it looks like. I went back into my inspector, I restored the video, and I deleted all the JavaScript that were responsible for resizing it in the layout. And what you'll see is that as it resizes, the effect is much, much smoother. Because we're not relying on JavaScript anymore, we can essentially let the CSS do the heavy lifting, and we have that aspect ratio aware container, and we're stretching the video over that container. So this is an example, and a very simple one, of what I think of in terms of laziness in layout. Looking for opportunities to remove just a little bit of complexity from our designs, and in some cases that allow us to build effects that are going to allow us to do a little bit more, that might be more elegant than our default approach. So, and I've definitely been seeing that laziness applied on a slightly larger scale in the bigger layout systems that I've been working on. One recent example of this would be on the Responsive Web Design podcast page, and this is a podcast that Karen McGrain and I co-host. And we recently redesigned some of the section fronts to adopt this more grid-based layout. So you could actually just at a glance see multiple episodes, just to get a better breadth of the number of episodes and the kinds of people we're talking to. So Karen and I basically came up with this layout. We prototyped it a little bit. We did some paper sketching, and then sort of I finalized it in Sketch. And basically when I sort of started to think about building out this responsive design, looking at this one particular breakpoint, this 3-column layout, I can sort of tell as a designer that there are going to be certain things that I need to make this layout actually work, right? I mean, first and foremost, because a responsive design begins with a flexible grid, I'm going to begin with proportional widths of around 30%, proportional gutters of around 5%, and then finally, and maybe most importantly, I'm going to float all those elements to the left so I can create that 3-column layout. But this isn't quite the entire layout, right? There's a couple details that are actually missing on this slide. The first thing I'm going to want is I'm going to want to remove the right-hand margin from the rightmost cell, so it's actually butting up against the right-hand edge of the design, so I don't have any of those unsightly float drops. The other thing that I need, and this is really important, is I need to clear the left-hand float on the far left-hand side of the cell to ensure that it's basically clearing all the floats before it and actually starting a new row. Now, in the old days, like 8 months ago, I guess, the way I would do that was actually going into the HTML and attaching some classes to those special elements to say that this is the first element in each row or the last one. And then I could use those classes as hooks in my CSS to actually implement the layout accordingly. But this is actually kind of limiting if you think about it. Because if I'm building something that's going to adapt to multiple breakpoints, I don't actually want to describe the grid in my HTML. And as we heard from Jen today, there are a whole bunch of wonderful CSS tools that allow us to step back out of that need to describe our grids in our documents. We can actually control things at a higher level just in the CSS. And one of the most important tools for building layouts like this, at least for me, is nth child, a pseudo selector. And this is a great way of basically selecting elements in the design based on their position in the document. So for example, I could say something like episode nth child 2 to select the episode cell that's the second child of its parent. Without having to muddy the markup up, I can then style that cell independently of all of its siblings. That's completely useless. But where this gets really interesting is where something like nth child 2n comes in. Now 2n is a great thing because what happens now is that I've immediately selected every even numbered cell in the grid. This works because n is a counter. It starts from 0 and increments by 1 each time. So in other words, it's simple multiplication. 2 times 0, 2 times 1, 2 times 2, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't matter if there are 20 cells in this grid or 20,000. This one selector will select every even-numbered cell in the grid and allow me to style them. Not so helpful when you're building a 3-column layout, but what I can then do is I could do something like nth child 3n to remove that right-hand margin from every third cell in the grid. And then I could also say something like nth child 3n plus 1, selecting every third cell, but this time starting from 1 rather than 0. And this allows me to basically clear all the floats on each one of those cells, ensuring that each row is a nice discrete grouping of 3. So by stepping out of the HTML and actually describing my grid system only in CSS, this gives me a little bit more flexibility. With just 2 simple rules, I built a 3-column layout by applying some simple floats and then doing the finesse work around them. Where this gets really helpful is when you're building a larger responsive design system and architecting your breakpoints. So for example, going back to the podcast page, I mean, every responsive design I've started on since the Boston Globe has started from this small screen-friendly baseline design. It's just a simple sorting of tasks and content from top to bottom. It doesn't actually assume any kind of layout. But starting from this foundation, I can look for opportunities to enhance the design. So as it gets a little bit wider, at a breakpoint of around 44 ems, I can move to that 2-column layout in the middle using nth child 2n and 2n plus 1. And then as things get a little bit wider still, I can look for other opportunities to refine things, maybe tweak the typography. And then around at a breakpoint of 68.75 ems, because I like round numbers, I guess, I can go to a 3-column layout using nth child 3n and 3n plus 1. I think you might be able to see where this is going. Because I haven't actually described the grid layout in my HTML, this gives me much more flexibility as I move beyond the initial prescribed design. So I can move to a 4-column layout with nth child 4n, or move to a 5-column layout, or a 6-column layout, or 7, or whatever. We're at this point now with the tools available to us on the front end. We can build grid systems that are effectively infinite. We're really only constrained by the amount of time and resources we want to spend on designing and refining these grid systems. If we can let go of that need to perfectly describe our layout on the internals of our document, the structure and semantics of our designs, and step back and use tools like nth child or flexbox or using some combination of them, we can design more flexible and more device-agnostic responsive layouts. Which means this is probably an opportune time to talk a little bit about the F word, specifically frameworks. Now, Jen touched on this beautifully, and I want to say, I think frameworks are actually invaluable for me in my work. I use them very frequently when I'm prototyping ideas for a client, need to get ideas down on paper, as it were, really quickly. I can grab something like Foundation or Bootstrap and actually build a simple grid system very easily to talk about ideas with collaborators and clients. And I think if you're learning about responsive design or web design in general, I think these are wonderful, wonderful resources. And as Karen mentioned earlier, I think they're great from an organizational standpoint as well. Frameworks like these can actually take a lot of the ambiguity out of building larger interfaces. They do have a big problem, though, which I don't think we talk about very much, which is that they're heavy. Now, when I say heavy, I'm not talking about from a front-end performance standpoint, with all the extra markup patterns and classes that we're being asked to bring to them. I mean, they're conceptually heavy. They're a little prescriptive. They're maybe a little bit too rigid for all the challenges in front of us. In many cases, most of these frameworks are actually still focused on this idea of a page, that there's some ideal, canonical view of your design that's usually articulated in 12 columns, and then in the framework, you're actually articulating how you can adapt that design based off that reference layout. And with all the new device classes we're going to be supporting in the next few years, the ones we haven't even envisioned yet, maybe approaches like this aren't going to be as flexible or as nimble as we might need them to be. You know, I'm with Karen, who mentioned earlier, you know, I'm kind of skeptical about smartwatches being like a dominant browsing platform, but who knows? And I love this video of somebody actually browsing through the responsive redesign of TechCrunch.com on a browser that wasn't even invented yet, on a device that wasn't even invented yet when the redesign first launched. So with all the challenges in front of us and the new device classes we don't even know about, I wonder if columns and classes alone aren't going to necessarily be the best approach to some of these problems. Maybe we need something a little bit more lightweight, something that's going to be prepared for the stuff we don't even know about. I've been reading a lot lately about the early days of modern animation, where we had people like Winsor McCay and Max Fleischer, who were really some of the first people to take pen to paper and make drawings move. I mean, they were really shaping and defining a new young medium. They were actually trying to define what animation could be. But I don't think it takes anything away from their many accomplishments to sort of point out that their drawing, by modern standards, their animation definitely feels of its time. It feels a little mechanical. It lacks some nuance. Now this is because, I mean, frankly, they had a tough job. They were at the forefront of defining what animation could be. They didn't have time to sort of sit back in their divans and think about like lofty design principles and, you know, sort of talk about best practices for drawing. I don't know, maybe they did that. I don't know, no judgment. But it wasn't until a few decades later, when a man named Walt Disney founded his studio, that people sat up and took animation seriously as an art form. That sounds really pithy and trite, right? Especially, you know, by today's modern standards, right? Walt Disney being edgy. But, you know, there was something really true to that. You know, because his drawings were simple, almost crude by some of his contemporary standards. But when they were colored and animated, they felt human. They felt almost real. One of Disney's original animators, a man named Mark Davis, once said that before Disney founded his studio, animation had been done before, but stories were never told. That is some powerful shade throwing being tossed at pretty much every single one of Disney's competitors, but I think there's something true to that. Because his effect on the marketplace really can't be understated. Disney's drawings weren't technically more competent than a lot of their peers. In many cases, they were much simpler, much more elementary looking. But when they came to life, when characters moved from one end of the frame to the other, audiences could actually empathize with the animation that they were seeing for the very first time. They could see something human in them. Now, this wasn't because Disney himself was an incredibly talented illustrator or animator, far from it. But he was an incredibly exacting director. And he demanded of his staff that they produce drawings that possessed what he called a caricature of realism, or an illusion of life. Now that's a tall order. I don't know if I want an art director coming at me with that kind of phrasing, but it's a wonderful line. And I think it perfectly encapsulates what Disney and his team were actually able to accomplish. What's more, it became the title of one of my favorite books, The Illusion of Life, written by two men named Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Now Thomas and Johnston were two of Disney's original 12 animators, and they tried to actually articulate how it was that they were able to meet those high standards that Disney put in front of his teams. And as a side note, I would totally recommend getting your hands on a copy of this book if you can. It's funny, it's beautifully designed, and it's really approachable for something that could have been a very technical manual. But as you're reading it, you're going to notice that they don't focus on dry topics like production tips or project management, or even the kinds of pencils that they preferred over the other. Instead, they took a step back and they talked a little bit more about what have since become known as the 12 basic principles of animation. Now, those principles have kind of defined what we in Western audiences kind of define as quality animation, as important as they were to the medium. And they were recently adapted in kind of an animated format, so I thought I'd play you just a quick excerpt from that adaptation.
The following has been paraphrased from The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Squash and stretch. This action gives the illusion of weight and volume to a character as it moves. Anticipation. Prepares the audience for a major action the character is about to perform. Each major action is preceded with specific moves that anticipate for the audience what is about to happen. Staging. It's the presentation of an idea so that it is clear.
It's a really cute video. I would totally recommend checking it out. It's very short, and to be fair to Johnston and Thomas, it's not a perfect translation of the 12 basic principles, but it's a nice paraphrasing. But as you're actually watching the video or you're reading more about the 12 basic principles, this was what allowed Disney's team to actually figure out whether or not they were meeting up to Disney's standards. So they could use the principles to talk about the quality of their work as it was evolving. As a character was moving from one end of the room to the other, did it have enough squash and stretch to actually preserve a fluidity of movement? If a character was about to throw an object, did the arm properly stage the action that was about to occur? In other words, these principles were a framework. They allowed Disney and his team to talk about the quality of their work as it was evolving from very rough states into finished production level code. But it wasn't a framework from the web sense. This wasn't a fixed set of items that had to be incorporated where people were walking around with checklists. Oh, I'm sorry, you don't have enough staging today, Lenny. We're going to have to go back to the drawing board. This was a vocabulary. This was a shared set of goals and principles that they could use to talk about whether or not they were actually living up to delivering that caricature of realism that Disney demanded of his team. In other words, this is a philosophical framework, not a rigid, prescriptive one. And I wonder if with all the challenges in front of us, maybe we should be focusing on building frameworks that are a little bit closer to that. There are a lot of precedents for this happening. And as much as we sort of talk about moving past the printed page, much of this has actually been happening in graphic design for decades. I mean, even very recently, the Whitney Museum recently rebranded. They came up with this beautiful, minimalist logo. And they actually called it the responsive W. And then they spent about 4 paragraphs describing how this had nothing to do with that really adorable responsive design thing that those web kids are talking about. But this is stunning work. This mark is simple, it's minimal, and it's also incredibly versatile. It can incorporate artwork from different exhibits upcoming in the museum. It can be experienced digitally, or maybe in physical printed places in museum goers' days. And if you're looking at all these different permutations of this one simple logo, you'd be forgiven for thinking there's some massive UNIVAC-sized computer sitting in a closet somewhere, great billows of smoke pouring out as it's algorithmically chewing out all these logo variations. I guess it's the part of the talk where it becomes clear I've never seen a computer. But there's actually a very, very simple framework that the designers used to come up with dozens, if not hundreds, of different variations of this one simple mark. And their framework looked exactly like this. So that if they were given a piece of media, or a certain portion of the screen, there would be certain fixed elements that had to be incorporated within that space. And then given that, in the remaining space available to them, they would divide it into 4 equal quadrants. And then from there, it's a simple matter of connecting the dots, from the top of one line to the bottom of the next, and so on and so forth. In other words, they designed the conditions that would then give rise to almost hundreds, if not thousands, of different logo variations. They focused less on layouts, and a conversation about quality was really where they invested their time. And many of the successful print and graphic designers of our time have really been sort of advocating for this more upfront focus on designing frameworks. Karl Gerstner is one of the best examples of this. He was a Swiss designer in the middle of the 20th century who did an incredible amount of branding work and had to articulate how those branding systems would adapt to differently sized media. And he once said, kind of famously, that instead of solutions for problems, we should be designing systems that support solutions. For no problem is there an absolute solution. Instead, there is always a group of solutions, one of which is the best under certain conditions. So rather than focusing on layout or columns and rows or pixel widths of different sized screens, I think it's incumbent upon us as designers and developers to work with our teams, with our clients, with our organizations to design a vocabulary that's going to support further responsive design, to help you figure out not just how to adapt different pieces of your designs to differently sized screen, but why you make those decisions. What constitutes good responsive design for you and your team is going to be different from every person who's sitting next to you. It's not just about columns and rows, in other words. And excitingly, I mean, this has been happening in the responsive design space. I mean, Jen mentioned this wonderful article by Nathan Ford about designing layouts from the content out in List Apart from last year. And yes, a big part of Nathan's argument was that we should be moving from regularly sized columns for these 12 or 16 pixel wide grids, and maybe we should reinvest some time in building ratios that have a sense of asymmetry and rhythm as we move from one end of the design to the other. But he also spent a significant amount of time talking about the individual modules and patterns within our responsive designs and figuring out how to make them change and when they should change. And to do so, he borrowed some techniques from the printed page, terms that designers would use to talk about gaps or breaks in their design and talk about refining them from there. One of the best examples that he listed was sevens, where you might find an image that's shortened as its width gets scaled down. So the text that accompanies it is squished, and it leaves these unsightly gaps underneath the image. That's an opportunity to adapt that module and change the layout or the typography in some way. You might have drifts, for example, where elements get removed from the pieces of information that they're actually associated with from a content standpoint. That's actually another opportunity to introduce a breakpoint, to refine the design a little bit more. On the other hand, you might have pinches, where elements get a little uncomfortably close to each other and they start forming unwanted relationships from a visual standpoint. Each one of these lets Nathan figure out when and how those individual modules need to adapt, when those stress fractures start to appear in a design. Now, this is just one example of a vocabulary that can be used to figure out how and when modules need to adapt. You will probably design your own vocabulary with you and your team. But regardless, I think this exercise is really helpful for thinking about your design not as a page, but as a network of content, as Trent said, or as I like to think of it, as a network of small layout systems. Each one of them responsive in its own way that's going to adapt kind of independently around the systems around them, but they could then get stitched together into a larger responsive design. One example might be a masthead that appears at the top of an application I designed a few years ago. And so one layout of this one layout system on the wide screen looks like a fairly traditional toolbar, right? With some central text in the middle, some buttons on the left and the right. But then as it falls below a certain point, it dramatically simplifies itself to a series of 5 or 6 links. The content and functionality is exactly the same, but the presentation and interaction of this one layout system has changed as it needed to be. Now, when you're designing small layout systems, it actually helps to take a step back from the layout in front of you. And this is definitely true for this masthead that we worked on a few years ago. So when we started, we were prototyping this kind of from a widescreen standpoint, which isn't always ideal from a responsive design. But then we basically sort of had to vet the design assumptions and sort the content and tasks into logical groups, basically grouping them into menus, treating them like little discrete interface buckets that we could then, above a certain breakpoint, move around as we had a little bit more room to experiment. So around a breakpoint of, let's say, 50 ems, we could then move to a widescreen layout and take them out of their default position and shoot them off to the left or the right-hand side of that layout system. But it's not always just about sort of taking elements and sort of shuttling them around. We can also look for opportunities to make better use of the space available to us. So for example, taking elements that might be in submenus by default on the small screen, and then, hey, we have a little bit more room on the wider screen layout. Why not promote them to be visible by default and put them right in the center of the toolbar? Now, one question you might ask is like, well, where did this measurement come from? Why 50 ems for that breakpoint? That's not tied to any specific screen size or device type. That's a breakpoint that's tied to the needs of this one particular layout system. In other words, that central piece of text inside the toolbar below a viewport width of around 50 ems, that text starts to be in danger of being clipped by the buttons that appear on either edge of it. So that makes a natural falling off point to simplify the design and preserve the integrity of this small layout system. In other words, if you can think about your media queries and your breakpoints as defending the integrity of your content, you're going to be much better positioned for the devices on hand today and the ones that we don't even know about yet. In other words, thinking about these small layout systems, not just in how they fit on different size screens, that's really the baseline for building a successful responsive layout. We want to think about the needs of these modules and patterns as feeling at home on any size screen, that regardless of the device the user happens to have, they couldn't imagine a better experience for that one particular module. Because honestly, we have plenty of challenges just to even do that, and most of them tend to revolve around navigation. Is designing responsive navigation the favorite part of anybody's day? I don't know if it's mine. There's a lot of experimentation happening around responsive nav systems. 538.com is a great example of this. On widescreen layouts, they have these teases that appear when you tap or click on those primary links to sort of, hint at content that's within each section. But then below a certain point, the nav simplifies itself to just the primary links. In other words, those drop-downs are seen as widescreen enhancements. They're not core value to this nav system. Coop.se is a really beautiful e-commerce site, and I love their navigation, how it adapts a couple times and then dramatically simplifies itself into this off-canvas menu pattern, as it's called. And when somebody taps or clicks on an element on the smaller end of the design, it sort of moves into view. Walmart.ca, responsive design from about a year and a half ago, I think. They have a completely visible nav on wider screens, and then on smaller ones, they've also adopted this off-canvas pattern. Tap or click, and it moves into view when the user's ready to interact with it. So there's been a lot of different responsive nav patterns out there. There's a lot of experimentation and discussion, which is really valuable. But at least in the examples that I've showed you, they all share one characteristic, and you've probably spotted it already, which is your good friend and mine, the hamburger. Does anyone else miss the hamburger? Yeah? All right. Is anyone else hungry? Maybe it's just me. I mean, the hamburger's great, right? I mean, it's compact, it's terse, it's very apparent to our users what it might be, hopefully. It's easy to incorporate in our designs with SVG or with some Unicode. But I'm here today, guys, to suggest that maybe the hamburger's not all it's cracked up to be. In fact, it's possible that maybe we as an industry have a little bit of a hamburger problem. So, there's a couple potential issues with this icon. I mean, first and foremost, as terse as it is, as nicely resizable as it is, it does actually have a meaning. It does have a cultural context. Specifically, this 3-bar pattern is the Chinese trigram for sky, or heavens, which feels a little bit like a weird choice for tap or click on this thing to get directions to our restaurant. I don't know. Could just be me. But, I mean, maybe we can respectfully appropriate things from other contexts. Maybe that's okay. But there's some indications out there that maybe this icon by itself isn't as clear as we might like it to be. This is Time.com, who responsibly redesigned last year. And this is a beautiful piece of work. And they have multiple tiers of navigation. And I think they've executed on them really well. But they made an interesting decision when they first launched, which is they hamburgered themselves. That's a verb now. And up in the top left, you'll see that there's the icon with a label of menu. And if your device had a mouse attached to it, you could actually hover over that menu. And the first time the page actually loaded, there would be this helpful overlay that magically appeared. And then if you did take that mouse and you hovered over that icon, it would also say, click to show site navigation. So we have the icon, we have the menu label, we have the overlay, we have the tooltip. I've never been very good at math, but I think that's at least 15 different levels of help text. Now, this suggests a couple things to me. I didn't work on this redesign, but this suggests that either stakeholders weren't confident in the icon to stand on its own as a clear signpost for what it was actually going to perform, or maybe the hamburger didn't actually perform well in acceptance testing, so it felt that there was some actual help that needed to be introduced. Now, there's also some indications that the ability to conceal navigation, putting the hamburger aside, is actually kind of problematic, potentially. This is the responsive Disney.com, which is a beautiful piece of responsive work. It's really well done. But you'll notice that on smaller screens, that hamburger, when you tap or click on it, reveals an off-canvas menu that contains every single link that's ever been invented on the World Wide Web. If you were looking for that GeoCities page you designed back in 1997, I'm not kidding, it's scrolled past to like level 4 or 5, so FYI. So the ability to conceal navigation is absolutely critical. I'm all about reducing cognitive load on our users, but it can easily be taken too far. I think in many cases we're defaulting to this pattern because we want to present this immaculately tailored first look of our responsive designs to our first-time visitors. But sometimes I worry that they're tapping or clicking on that hamburger and that menu moves into view, and they see all the crap we didn't want to deal with in our redesign process. If anything, the ability to conceal content feels, to me at least, like a reminder that we really need to be designing mobile first, now more than ever. That in many cases, the complexity we're building into our nav systems is in many cases because it's a desktop-first artifact. So in other words, if something doesn't fit, navigation or otherwise, on that screen that's 80% smaller than what we've historically designed for, maybe we should have that discussion as an organization about the value it's serving to anybody if it doesn't feel right or at home on the small screen view. What's more, just because everyone's adapting the hamburger or off-canvas navigation doesn't necessarily mean that we have to. Popular patterns don't necessarily need to be defaults. In many cases, there are actually some really interesting and alternate approaches to responsive nav systems that we're not really talking about. One of them I like to call the progressive reveal. The BBC News recently launched this beautiful global responsive site. And they adopted this approach that's kind of interesting, where they have this more link at the end of their primary nav, and then they sort of treat it like an overflow drawer. So that as their design gets a little bit narrower, they take links out of the primary nav and they shuttle them down to this overflow space. and then below a certain point, they simplify things down to a simple show-hide toggle. The Guardian have taken a really interesting approach to this. They have sort of a semi-responsive layout, but you'll notice that up at the top of the screen, they have this all sections link, replete with hamburger icon. But if you tap or click on that, you get this incredibly exhaustive sitemap that shows you basically all the main content areas, also key topics within each one. And that appears on every size screen, small or large. The primary navigation, however, is never hidden from view. It's always visible. But they took a really interesting approach, which is that they created kind of a scrollable region within that navigation. So that if you happen to have a touch-based interface, or maybe you're using a mouse, you can actually easily move left or right to actually view the whole navigation. I think this is a really interesting approach. Just adapting the layout can actually be a really great way of managing navigation responsibly. 2 examples of this that I really love. A Filament Group have a very simple and very striking responsive design, and they have a very simple navigation menu. Just 4 simple links. 5. I'm good at counting, I mentioned that. But you'll notice that on the homepage, that navigation is never hidden from view. It's treated as a first-class citizen because of the signposting it offers new visitors. It's right in the hero area by default. On internal pages, however, where the content needs to be a little bit more of a focus, they've adopted a show-hide pattern on smaller screens. What I like about this approach is that they're not inventing new patterns for this, but they do show that we can be a little bit more nuanced in the application of them. We don't necessarily have to adopt a set once and forget it approach to responsive nav patterns. We can look a little bit more intelligently about the context of where they actually sit in our sites. Frank Camaro, who has one of my favorite responsive sites out there, he also redesigns it every 3 months, I think, has a very simple and very striking masthead. And you'll notice, I mean, when we're talking about systems that feel at home on any size screen, he's taken an incredible amount of care on the lockup and composition of both the tagline and the navigation together. It's really beautifully done. And if we're talking about laziness from an implementation standpoint, I mean, he has done it very simply. He's got the tagline in the masthead and the navigation on the right. He doesn't have to manage the width and floats of those individual elements. He can simply declare that containing element to be a flexbox. And then the 2 child elements immediately occupy the space available to them in 2 columns. And if he wanted to, I mean, not that he would necessarily, but he could simply change the polarity within that container simply by applying flex direction row reverse to change those 2 elements' position relative to each other, without having to manage the layout of those individual elements. We have so many great tools available to us. And we should look for opportunities to maybe just be a little bit lazier. The reason Filament Group and Frank have really got these beautiful mastheads is because they really focused on distilling their navigation down to the bare essentials. Yes, they're very simple. Yes, they're very straightforward, but I think that's part of why these patterns work so well for them. In other words, if we can look for opportunities to conserve our effort a little bit more, maybe we could have a little bit more fun with our responsive design. Save some energy for interesting details around the edges, like, for example, animation. To do that, let me tell you a quick story about a circle I designed recently. Hold your applause. Why are you laughing? To be fair, it's actually about 4 circles, so a little more credit, I guess. Now, I've been working on a lot of responsive web applications recently. I don't actually know what a web application is, but I've been told I've been working on them. And in them, they might have a lot of transactional elements, many stacked on top of each other. And each one of those individual patterns has responsive layouts, but they might want to convey state change in interesting ways, like this 4 across picker. When we started thinking about how we could take this responsive pattern and actually introduce some animation to it, we did a bunch of paper prototyping, moving from this simple layout in Photoshop, and then we came up with a simple animation scheme, which was, in other words, that of the 4 elements in this pattern, when the user selected an element, it could be the first one or the 4th one, it would move into the 2nd position in the row. Simultaneously, an OK and a cancel button would appear to allow the user to confirm or back out of that change. And then there would be all the fun transition-y, animation-y stuff that all the kids are talking about today. Now, to do this, it's tempting, I think, from a design or development standpoint when you're thinking about implementing this or prototyping this. It's easy to focus on the typography or the circles or the animation itself. But when you're building any kind of pattern for a responsive design, whether it's interactive or not, it's important to step back from the layout and the animation and focus on the transaction rather than the finished interface. Independent of CSS, maybe if the user doesn't actually see the images as you and I might, what are we actually trying to ask them to do? So if we step aside from the animation or the aesthetics, we're asking the user to make a choice, and just one choice out of 4 separate elements, and then confirm or back out of that choice. So before we start talking about rounded corners and typography and animation, what we're actually talking about is a series of radio buttons. This is the foundation for this one pattern. It's a simple form with 4 radio buttons, each one of them associated with a label. That label contains an image and some text, and at the bottom of the form we have an OK and a cancel button, which is a simple submit button and a reset button to restore the form to its default state. This will not win any awards, but this is the foundation for everything that's then going to follow on top of it, because once we thought about the transaction independent of the aesthetics, we can then start layering more complexity on top of this. So in certain enhanced browsers, we could do things like, for example, hide the radio buttons excessively. We're going to remove them from sighted viewers and put them off canvas so the user is only interacting with the label that remains on the page. And then we can actually set those labels to be table cells so they occupy 25% of their row. And then we can use border radius of 50% to basically round off all the visible elements. Now there's some other simple styling that kind of surrounds these, but these are really the core styles that move us from simple radio buttons into something that looks more like this, with rounded elements and some simple typography. Now this is not animated, and the layout is not where we want to end up, right? I mean, things are stacked on 2 rows. But just as with that simple HTML element, this is the next step in the process, the foundation for the one that's going to follow. Now to figure out if we can actually proceed, we're going to ask the browser if it supports more advanced animation rules. If it passes that test, if it answers yes, I support these properties, then we're going to apply a class of hasAnimation to the HTML element. What this allows us to do is actually quarantine more advanced rules for the browsers that will benefit from them. So we can, in browsers that pass that test, use absolute positioning to take the action buttons and put them up over the individual radio buttons that the user is going to be interacting with. In other words, I just broke the form. I did a good job. But this is, again, just sort of the next step in the process, because what we can then do is we can use scale transforms to take those buttons and actually turn them into 0-pixel tall and wide elements, and then stack them with z-index underneath the labels that the user interacts with. We've just hidden them from view. We also want to reuse that rule for any element the user didn't select, and that's where this more complicated rule comes into play. It looks a little bit hairy, but basically all we're saying in plain English is that if our form has a class of selected, hide all the labels that don't have a class of checked. In other words, the JavaScript that we're going to write to finish off this pattern doesn't actually have to manage animation or position of elements. All it has to do is that when the user makes a selection, the JavaScript is going to apply a class of checked to the label the user just tapped or clicked on, and then apply a class of checked to the form to signify that there's been some sort of change to the internals. When that happens, all the elements that the user didn't select are going to use that same transform and disappear from view. So we have our layout, we have a show hide mechanic, and this is where we can complete the effect. Things get a little bit more complicated, but then we're going to basically define some transitions on our elements using transform and opacity transitions, and then on the individual elements, when a label element has a class of selected, we're going to use translate X transforms to slide it into the second position. It looks a little complicated, but really all we're saying is that of the 4 elements, we know that that second position is where we want anything that's been selected to end up. And then we can use nth child to basically say that each one of those elements is going to slide by units of 100% into that second position. So in other words, when the JavaScript applies that selected class to any label, it's going to slide into that area. And then the JavaScript's then going to remove the class when they either make another selection or they hit the cancel button. The JavaScript only does the class toggling, and the CSS is doing the rest of the heavy lifting. Now, maybe it's the end of the day. Maybe it's the pecan pie you guys had during the break, but I see some crossed arms, I see some skeptical faces, and that's okay, right? I mean, you know, we basically started with something like this. We started with HTML inputs that are very simple and basically styled. And then we enhanced up lightly into something that's a little bit more rounded and a little bit more enhanced, but not quite the finished effect. And then we applied a whole bunch of confusing looking transitions and animations to finish off the final pattern. In other words, we didn't design one interface, we designed 3. And in many ways, maybe that feels like the opposite of what I said in the beginning, that we should be looking for opportunities to do a little bit less. So skepticism's okay, I totally get it. But I would actually argue, with all the complexity and all the challenges we're dealing with, this is actually one of the laziest approaches possible to designing interactive or even non-interactive elements on the web today. because a well-crafted responsive design has to be device agnostic by default. Now that's maybe a loaded term, but Trent Walton wrote recently about how it's actually a really powerful guiding design principle for him and his colleagues at Paravel. And in his blog entry, he basically argued that device agnostic means moving beyond just widths and heights of screen. That's basically just the first step in the journey of dealing with all the complexity we deal with. We're designing for browsers that are hostile to preserving the integrity of our design. We're dealing with screens both incredibly large and incredibly small. We're dealing with slow, maybe buggy connection speeds. And we're dealing with more input methods than ever before. And he argued that there's more to devices than just the size of the screen. A device-agnostic approach also takes into account infinite combinations of screen resolution, input method, browser capability, and connection speed. In other words, like cars designed to perform in extreme heat or on icy roads, we have to be building websites to face the reality of the web's inherent variability. What Trent is arguing for is, on one level, progressive enhancement, but he's also talking about designing for failure and building up from there. And this has been at the heart of every responsive design at scale over the last few years. I mentioned the BBC earlier, but they're a wonderful example of this. Because if you access their beautiful responsive design on any sufficiently capable browser, you're going to see a great responsive design that's incredibly fast, but also has all these great little UI niceties kind of around the edges, like tabs that toggle content, or menus that expand in place, or secondary stories that have thumbnail images associated with them. But this is just one view of this responsive design. Because if you're on a slightly less capable browser, or maybe you're in a great browser and certain network conditions happen to foil things, you still have a completely responsive design, but it's going to experience a little bit differently. Those menus are actually just going to be skip links down to the bottom of the page where the menus reside natively. Tabs are actually just links by default that move you to separate pages where the content resides by default. And secondary stories don't actually have images associated with them. Those are seen as enhancements, not core content that the user actually cares about. In other words, the BBC is designing a basic baseline experience that's served universally to every web-connected browser on the planet. And then conditionally, they're enhancing up into something that's a little bit more refined, but it's still the BBC News experience on the web. Now, the way that the BBC actually determines which version of this design they get is with a process that they call cutting the mustard, which is my new favorite phrase. Does your browser cut the mustard, sir? What this means in practice is that they're loading just enough code to see if your browser can benefit from more advanced code. They ask a question in JavaScript that's inlined at the top of every page to sort of see if you are sufficiently modern as a device or as a browser. And if you pass that test, great. They bootstrap the experience with extra CSS and extra JavaScript to refine the experience just that little bit more. But if it fails that test, that's fine. You're left with an underlying experience that's still beautiful, it's incredibly fast, and it's still responsive. What this means for the BBC and for The Guardian and other publishers and brands that have adopted this approach is it allows them to step back from managing an infinite combination of devices and browsers and all the bugs and combinations that come with them. In other words, it allows them to think about their responsive design as existing in two incredibly broad experience tiers, both fast and both responsive, but the experience has been intelligently delivered up from that baseline experience. In other words, designing with progressive enhancement, designing from a device-agnostic standpoint, is one of the laziest ways you can build interfaces for the web today. And I applaud anybody who adopts it. So just to wrap things up, I mean, these are just a few of the challenges in front of us. The web is everywhere. It's every size. It can be accessed on any class of device. And the number of those devices is almost going to be compounding on a monthly basis. And these are just a few of the things that we have to think about and deal with. And I absolutely believe that with all of these challenges, established third-party patterns and frameworks are definitely going to be part of the solution. But it's also worth remembering that those third-party patterns and frameworks are in many cases just a snapshot of the web as we understand it right now. And they may not necessarily always be ready for the challenges in front of us. There's this concept in Buddhism of the beginner's mind that basically argues that if you're approaching a problem that you've solved 100 times or 1,000 times before, each time you approach that challenge, you should try to disabuse yourself of that prior experience and sort of experience things with fresh eyes, the eyes of a child, or more appropriately, the eyes of a beginner. And I don't know about you, but this has been really playing through my mind as I've been sitting in the back of the room throughout the today's talks. Because Jeffrey began the day arguing that we need to have a greater respect for our craft and for ourselves. And Jasenia talked about how the network that we're designing with is actually a material that we should plan for and a constraint that we should incorporate into our design process. Jen talked about the future of page layouts and responsive design and how it's actually much closer than we might think. And Cameron actually eloquently argued for a more unified approach to designing digital experiences. And then finally, Karen gave a wonderful, beautiful argument about how our content needs to be as modular and as flexible as our design systems need to be. And you guys, we're only halfway there. We're going to be hearing so many wonderful things from Lara, from Eric, from Jason, from Brad, from Matt, from Jeremy tomorrow, arguing about the future of design, of technology, the future of communication, the future of our craft on the web in general. And I don't know about you, but I feel inspired. But I also feel like a beginner. So as we leave this room and we get together and have a conversation out in the lobby in the middle of this beautiful city that I always love visiting, let's remember that we can approach the new challenges in front of us together, that we have the skills and the ability and the will to meet some of these issues head on. But as we do, let's remember that sometimes there's actually value in doing just a little bit less. And in many cases, it can actually enable us to do so much more. In other words, I give you permission to go forth and just be a little bit lazy from time to time. And I'd like to thank you very much for yours.